About a week ago, the G7 countries implemented a price cap on Russian oil. This came at about the same time that the EU was beginning its embargo on said oil. However, will these actions have any impact on Russia? Or could they backfire and send oil prices through the roof? That's exactly what I'm going to be covering in my video today. So, this is one you don't want to miss. The war in Ukraine has been going on for almost a year now. This is in large part because Russia's oil money machine has been printing cash. As the world's second largest oil producer, Russia was well positioned to benefit from the increased oil prices that its aggression has brought about. In fact, by some estimates, higher energy prices could see Russia earning $337 billion in exports this year. That's a 38% rise on last year. Naturally, this meant that NATO and the West have been zeroing in on that energy revenue and trying to slow it down. Of course, this is easier said than done because there are many countries in the G7, and those in Europe specifically, who depend on this energy and oil. This is something that I've talked about ad nauseum on the channel, and I'll link to my videos on it in the description for you guys. Now, when it comes to the oil market, these discussions have been going on for months. For example, the EU oil embargo was first agreed back in May, when the bloc got an agreement together that would see 90% of their imports from Russia curtailed. However, some European countries managed to get exemptions, specifically those that relied on pipeline imports. Now, the price cap discussion has also been going on for some time. There were concerns around the impact that any cap would have on the supply of oil hitting the market. As the world's second largest producer, if Russia were to curtail supply, it could lead to a spike in oil prices more generally and more pain for consumers around the world. When it comes to the free market, you can only dictate a price until the seller decides that said price is economically unfeasible. Some countries in Europe also worried that should they go ahead with the cap, then they would be precluded from getting any supplies from Russia. Other countries like Poland, Estonia, and of course Ukraine thought that the cap was too low and that it wouldn't have that much of an impact on Russian oil revenues. In the end, they settled on a $60 per barrel price cap. This was a carefully chosen price level because it wasn't too far off from the price that Russia was actually getting for its oil on the global market. In fact, when it comes to the Ural grade of crude, the cap is above its market price. The theory here was that the Russians wouldn't be too perturbed by the price cap and would still consider supplying the oil to the market, even to those countries that agreed to sign on to the cap itself. Indeed, Russia's foreign minister gave the clearest sign yet that Russia would be doing this because, quote, the cap was irrelevant. Moreover, there were many questions as to the efficacy of any cap to begin with, because Russia could always route its oil supplies to countries that didn't abide by the cap. So, this begs the very important question, why implement it at all? Well, one of the dominant lines of thinking around the price cap is that even if other countries that did not abide by the cap bought oil from Russia, they would still have some additional bargaining power. That's because they know that Russia would not be able to sell above $60 in the G7 and EU, so they could conceivably name any price above $60. Indeed, countries like India and China have been using this tactic to get low-priced Russian oil. Then there's also the much broader question around how the price cap could impact Russia's ability to move its oil to any countries in the first place. That's because the price cap will also apply to those firms in the G7 and the EU that play a key role in servicing the Russian oil industry. This includes ships registered in these countries, as well as insurers and reinsurers. Basically, these companies are prohibited from transporting or servicing any ships or cargo that are carrying Russian crude that was bought at a price above the cap. That means that even if Russia was able to make a deal with other countries to buy oil above the cap, it could not rely on a steady stream of tankers and ships to get that oil to the market. I should also note that not all Russian grades of crude oil trade at or near the price of the cap. For example, there is the key ESPO grade that's currently trading at $70. This is the grade that's delivered to Asia, and it's uncertain whether this crude will fall under the cap. However, this uncertainty does create a massive pain for Russia and adds to the cost of getting the goods to market. The cap would also cap the revenue that Russia could potentially earn should oil prices ever shoot up again. This is something that Russia fully capitalized on in the wake of the invasion, and something that it may not be able to rely on going forward. Moreover, the price cap is not fixed. There is an adjustment mechanism that can move the price up or down. If EU countries are able to find alternative sources of crude and are no longer scared of Russian threats, then they could easily adjust the cap even lower. For example, there are many who think that a $50 price cap would cut into Russia's earnings such that it would make it impossible for the country to balance its budget, called fiscal break-even. Even then, though, this would still be above the cost of production, so it may still be high enough to keep Russia selling into the market. That said, there are still many oil analysts who think that this price cap is likely to have limited impact and could potentially even mean more Russian oil being routed to Asia and countries not subject to the cap. There's also the potential that the shipping of Russian oil won't be too badly impeded, even if shipping companies abide by the cap. That's because Russia could always arrange separate side deals with the customer country in question. For example, if a country exported another commodity that Russia relied on, then they could arrange a deal whereby the shipment would officially be for oil below the cap, but still see Russia getting a fair payment in other goods. You should also consider that it's quite hard to verify that crude on a ship has been bought below the cap. Documents are easy to fake. Or indeed that a tanker is carrying Russian oil to begin with. Oil is a fungible asset. Of course, Russia may not even have to use Western ships and fleets. That's thanks to what is called the shadow fleet. For those unfamiliar, this is basically a non-compliant fleet of ships that service and transport the crude oil of countries that are subject to sanctions. This has grown considerably over the past 10 years in response to US sanctions on nations like Venezuela and Iran. There is no single definition of what makes up the shadow fleet, but some tankers change flags, turn off transmitters, send out decoy signals, or even swap oil at sea. Remember, it's fungible. Others paint over ship names, falsify documents, and mask control over vessels through layers of ownership and management firms. Now, I'll leave links to this Wall Street Journal article that talks about this shadow tanker fleet. It's a fascinating read. Anyways, the TLDR is that Russia has been building up this shadow fleet. Not only is it marshalling the current shadow fleet to its shores, but the fleet is expanding at a rapid pace as ship owners look to buy a flotilla of second-hand tankers. So, if it were to come to it that these Western ships couldn't transport Russian crude, then this shadow fleet could be ready to pick up the slack and ship this oil to the markets willing to pay a decent price. That's the price cap, though. Let's now turn to the oil embargo, as this is likely to have a much larger impact not only on Russia, but also on Europe. The ban that went into effect was for Russian seaborne crude, which accounts for 90% of the EU's oil imports. A special exemption was made for pipeline crude in order to incentivize Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic to sign on to it. About 34% of the EU's oil imports came from Russia in 2021. This is still a massive hole to fill, and the burden is not borne equally across member states. For example, Hungary was reluctant because 60% of its oil imports came from Russia. There were also a number of other EU countries that depended on this oil. You can see which ones over here. What that means is that the EU will have to replace this Russian crude with crude sourced from other countries. And to be fair, it has been quite active in its diversification strategy over the past 6 months. For example, as you can see in this chart over here, Russian oil imports have now fallen down to 21% of the total amount. This is thanks to imports from North America, Africa, and the Middle East. Whether the EU can keep up with the embargo will depend on how the oil market reacts to these measures, something I'll touch on in a bit. That said, when it comes to the EU-Russia business relationship for oil, Russia needs the bloc more. That's because the EU is a big customer for Russian oil and other products. In fact, in 2021, the EU was the top destination for oil exports at 29% of Russia's total. It also imports a great deal of Russian oil products at 16% of the total, as seen here. Now that's important to note because while the ban currently only applies to seaborne crude, on the 5th of February this will also move to include all refined oil products. Moreover, Germany and Poland are getting ready to stop purchasing oil via the Druzhba pipeline, due to begin in 2023. So, if you include total crude imports as well as refined products, then over 50% of Russia's exports were going to Europe last year. If Russia is going to try and sell this crude, it's going to have to find new buyers. However, that's easier said than done. Firstly, when it comes to that lost pipeline oil, it's going to be difficult to just reroute. For example, it can't just send this crude oil to its ESPO, East Siberia Pacific Ocean pipeline. That's because it's already running at near full capacity, sending Asia oil. It'll also struggle to ship this oil in tankers, as Russian oil ports are also running at full capacity. Of course, the price cap and the limited tanker fleet is further adding to the pressure there. Moreover, even if Russia offers favourable terms for the oil, well below the cap, countries like India, China and Turkey already have long-term supply contracts with countries in the Middle East, contracts that need to be fulfilled. Russia also needs to be careful about the implications of relying on too few buyers. That's why it's been doing deals with smaller countries like Sri Lanka and Cuba. Still, it seems unlikely that these countries will be able to effectively make up for the lack of demand coming from Europe. Okay, so that's the embargo. The broader question now is, how will all of these measures impact on oil prices next year? Well, that's pretty hard to tell. That's because the price of oil is driven by both supply and demand. Moreover, there are questions as to how resolute the G7 will be when it comes to sticking with these punitive sanctions in the face of sky-high oil prices. But let's start with the broader supply on the oil market. For one, you have to consider what OPEC will do in the new year. About 2 months ago, it cut production down to 2 million barrels per day, a move which predictably angered the US and the G7. This is something I talked about in much greater detail in my video linked to below. Well, a day before the cap was meant to go into effect, OPEC Plus held an emergency meeting. Some members were worried that the cap could see a disruption of about 1 to 1.5 million barrels a day. Hence, they advocated for increasing the agreed output. On the other hand, however, the Saudi energy minister wanted to further bring down output over fears that lackluster Chinese demand was weighing on energy prices. In the end, however, it was agreed that they would keep oil output at the previously agreed 2 million barrels per day. The broader question for the market is what happens to demand over the coming months. China has been one of the biggest drags to world growth, given its zealous approach to zero COVID. Indeed, there were concerns a few weeks ago that the surging numbers we're seeing in China could lead to more of those repressive lockdowns, the type that crushes both human rights and oil demand at the same time. However, it seems as if things could be beginning to turn, as China has now scrapped some of the most unpopular measures, including testing and quarantine requirements. The speed with which Beijing is abandoning its pandemic measures is pretty unprecedented. And this has, of course, led many to believe that oil demand is likely to spike globally once China's economy fully opens up. For example, according to Singapore's foreign minister, China's reopening will have a much bigger impact on oil prices than any cap on Russian oil. If significant oil demand comes back online in China, then we could start seeing prices rise globally again. This then begs the broader question of what it will mean for the oil markets with a $60 cap, where prices are way above that cap. China can always increase the price that it pays for Russian crude. However, countries in the G7 can't. This means that Russia could continue to route global oil shipments away from these other countries to those that are not enforcing the cap. This could have further upward pressure on the oil prices and further drive Russian shipments away from G7 and EU countries. There's also the broader question of whether Russia is likely to respond more forcefully to the cap. There has been talk of legislation in Moscow that will ban oil sales to any country that implements it. Now, whether this is just bluster is hard to tell, but the higher the price goes, the less Russia will ship to these countries and the less it will care about a complete ban of oil shipments. Of course, the cap is dynamic. Next year, there will come a time when the price would need to be reassessed. If the G7 raises it, then that will show Russia that they're toothless. If they bring it down again, then they could do damage to Russia's fiscus, but also to oil consumers in their respective countries. We mustn't forget that there is still one more ban that is due, and that's the one that will see the EU banning imports of refined Russian crude, including diesel fuel. This may be a lot harder for member countries to get around than the broader oil ban. According to Vortexa, the European Union and the UK received almost half of their waterborne imports of diesel-type fuel from Russia in November. That means that Europe will have only 3 months in order to find alternative suppliers of diesel. It won't be an easy task, though. Much as they learned when trying to buy LNG, liquefied natural gas, on the open market, there are another of other buyers out there also bidding for it. Europe is set to face Asia, the US, and Latin America in a battle for diesel barrels. Global diesel supplies were already playing catch-up with demand even prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine back in February. It's also not as if Europe has a lot of diesel reserves ready. According to data from S&P, diesel and gas oil stocks in the Amsterdam-Rotterdam-Antwerp hub sat at 1.7 million metric tons, 24.9% below the 5-year average in late November, and their lowest since 2008. However, Europe does have additional suppliers in the pipeline. These include additional volumes to come from Saudi Arabia's Jazan and Kuwait's Al Zour refineries. However, these will take some time to be fully operational, and according to Warren Peterson, head of commodity strategy at ING Bank, quote, "The bulk of this new supply will only become available quite some time after the EU ban on Russian refined products comes into force." So, what this means is that consumers in Europe could face higher prices for diesel-type fuels in the new year. It'll be a difficult balancing act for the EU. On the one hand, the resolve to cut off supplies from Russia, while on the other, the ire of citizens already facing sky-high inflation. I sure wouldn't want to be the one having to make those decisions. Okay, time for a few of my closing thoughts on this. The West has been stuck between a rock and a hard place. They wanted to try and limit Russia's oil revenues, but all the measures they took, sanctions, had the perverse effect of increasing oil prices. This meant that Russia would make even more money to fund its war. However, after months of wrangling, Western nations have finally passed some measures that go to the heart of Russia's oil exports. However, their effectiveness remains to be seen. When it comes to the price cap, $60 is still above the cost of fiscal break-even and way above the cost of production. Those oil revenues are not stopping anytime soon, and Russia is finding new buyers around the world. It's growing its shadow fleet and learning from both Venezuela and Iran that, despite the harshest sanctions possible, the market for oil remains. As for the embargo, this could have more bite. Europe is the largest importer of Russian oil, and finding buyers to fill the gap will be a difficult task. Moreover, rerouting that crude to said buyers won't be an overnight process. Other pipelines are running full and the shadow fleet is stretched. But it won't be easy for Europe either. This will become even more apparent when that diesel embargo comes into force in February. Consumers could face higher prices at the pump, and this could put further pressure on European leaders. Then, of course, there are the much broader questions of Chinese demand and OPEC output. These will be massive drivers of oil prices in the coming months, and right now, no one knows exactly how these things will pan out. There's also a potential happier resolution, and that's if the war in Ukraine comes to an end. However, the likelihood of this happening ultimately lies with some very opinionated leaders on both sides of the divide. So, the only thing that's certain right now is uncertainty. Oil market volatility will be the norm. And that's it for my video today, folks. If you enjoyed it, you know what to do. Hit that like button, subscribe button, and bell icon too. If you want to get some of the best promos, discounts, and offers in the crypto space, then my deals page is the place. Exclusive offers only for viewers of this channel. That's linked to in the description for you fine people. Time's up for this guy, which means it's time to say goodbye.